Well, hello from ASPI in Canberra. It's Peter Jennings here, Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming the several hundred people that are going to be on this call, joining us from Australia and around the world for the launch of our latest publication, Taking the Low Road, a detailed analysis of China's influence in Australian states and territories. Now, for those of you watching, we will get to your questions as this session goes on. So please use the question function down at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen and start thinking about the questions that you'd like me to put to our participants. Now, I'm very pleased that we are being joined this evening by two senators from the great state of Victoria to help us launch the book. Liberal Senator James Paterson, Chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and Labor Senator Kimberley Kitching, Chair of Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade References Committee, and Deputy Chair of the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Legislation Committee. And welcome to you both. Thank you for taking the time out of a busy parliamentary week, and I'll turn to you for comments in a minute. Also joining us is Bertel Wenger, Head of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation's Office for Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific, John Fitzgerald, the editor of this volume, one of Australia's leading China scholars and professor at the Swinburne University of Technology, Dr. Mark Harrison, who is Senior Lecturer in Chinese Studies at the University of Tasmania, and Professor Anne-Marie Brady from the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, and also a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Centre in Washington, DC, and also an ASPI Senior Fellow. So many excellent speakers and not much time, so we're going to dive straight into this evening's proceedings. Bertel, can I turn to you first? And I want to begin just by thanking you for KAS's sponsorship of the project. KAS's engagement, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung's engagement, comes about because not only are they a close partner of ASPI, but more importantly because the German federal system has its own experience of PRC engagement with the 16 Länder governments, the 16 provincial governments. And Bertel may have a little bit to say about that. Further, KAS has a global network of offices in over 120 countries. And with this volume completed, we're looking to see if a broader comparative project might lead to some useful results on a global basis. So to get proceedings underway, Bertel, can I hand to you for some brief remarks?
Absolutely. Peter, thank you very much for this introduction and introducing me and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation here in Australia and the Pacific. I have been director of the regional program as of November last year, so it's only very recently that I've come to this beautiful country, and I'm very happy to be here tonight and for us to be a close partner of ASPI in more than this one endeavor. So we are very happy to support this important publication, especially in light of recent events that we have all witnessed, for example, today in the news, as yet again we have been informed about possible undue practices influencing politics in Australia. As you said, Peter, Germany and Australia are very similar when it comes to their federal structure with the federal states and the challenges that they pose for us in dealing with China in its ever more assertive way in dealing with us. Let me make this very clear in the beginning. What we all are welcoming in our free and liberal societies in Germany and Australia alike are very close ties to the people of China, people-to-people contacts. We're very welcoming academic and cultural enrichment, as well as business opportunities for our nations. This is all welcome. What is not welcome is taking advantage of deliberately unleveled playing fields, outright coercion in order to enforce certain views or political behavior, suppression of human rights, of democratic procedures, and academic and other freedoms. And all of this only for the sake of a autocratic and authoritarian party to stay in power. If we look to Germany, we are experiencing ever since the early 90s very close economic relations between China and Germany. Maybe just like Australia, for quite some time, we've been closing our eyes on the downside of these ever closer economic relations. In Germany, we are witnessing a worrying influence on business already, especially in the car industries and when it comes to telecommunications. And as I said, as liberal and federal countries with a high degree of independence and sharing of power in our respective states, we face the same problems dealing with China. And this is why we're happy to support this publication with a lot of determination, because it gives us very concrete recommendations on how to deal with China according to our beliefs. And among these beliefs, let me outline a few. We have to conclude that China is increasingly becoming a systemic rival. China wants to change the value and rules-based international order into a Sinocentric world order, and is also increasingly appearing as a military challenger. China's new understanding poses a strategic challenge for the Western world, which requires well-considered and coordinated responses. Our joint China policy must therefore be guided by the guiding principle of defending and, if possible, strengthening the existing value and rules-based international order against this strategic challenge. And let me be clear, we want cooperation with China wherever there are common interests and our values and interests are not adversely affected. And it is clear that we must not be divided by cooperation with China. We need a joint strategy and policy. And in doing so, we are guided by the idea of seeking cooperation with China where this is possible and sensible, and where there is genuine Chinese willingness. At the same time, we need a policy of firmness and unity in areas where China is a particular challenge. In principle, it must apply that the respective China policy and the choice of its means must not have a disadvantageous or burdensome effect on its partners. In view of the economic challenges, we should finally get China to comply with the agreed international rules and standards. This includes, in particular, non-discriminatory access to the Chinese market. At the same time, we should strengthen our competitiveness and counter market distortions induced by the state economy, forced technology transfer, and unfair or even illegal methods with existing and new WTO-compliant trade policy protection instruments. Equal competitive conditions must not be an empty phrase, but must become a living reality, also with regard to the containment of tax measures that distort competition. We must make our market economy systems more resilient without giving up the basic principles of a liberal economic system. So our joint commitment requires increased cooperation with all of our international partners in value. Together, we must build a strong and determined community of those like-minded nations. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our exchange today and the findings of this important publication.
Thanks so much, Bertel. And listening to your comments, I sort of reflect on the gap that exists between what we aspire to see in the international community and what we're actually currently getting at the moment. It's a long way to sort of work ourselves back to that functioning rules-based international order. Let me turn now to John Fitzgerald. John, it's been a mammoth effort in shepherding this work to conclusion. And John's been part of this project from the very beginning, helping to structure the intellectual design of the work, selecting the authors, coaxing them through drafts and revisions, and providing a masterful introduction and conclusion, as well as the chapter on Victoria. John, I think you've done a brilliant job. Perhaps I should also say at the outset that what we have here is actually the collaboration of 13 different authors, each of them in their different ways, people with deep experience and expertise around China and public policy. But you will see as you read the book differences of view, differences of emphasis, and that's entirely reasonable and appropriate in a report of this matter. John, in just a few minutes, if you can you share with us what your key takeaways are in terms of the overall content of the publication?
Yes, Peter. So all credit to fellow authors here. My remarks are those of an editor. But they're consistent with Bertil's remarks. In fact, first we find, above all, that Australia's states, territories and business communities enjoyed mutually beneficial relations with China for well over 4 decades, from the late 70s through really till Xi Jinping's rise to power in the 2010s. And there's a sense in which all of the authors would like to see these productive relations continue. But with Xi Jinping's ascent, it's clear that authorities in China began leveraging long-standing subnational partnerships here in Australia with state and territory governments, with universities, with business associations, with community organisations, and so on, to voice their support for the party, for his leadership, for China's geopolitical interests in the region, in some cases contrary to Australia's national interests. So state and territory governments that had little formal role to play in national security suddenly found themselves in the middle of it. So too universities and businesses and business associations and community groups that rarely paid attention to foreign affairs in the broad suddenly found themselves entangled in public debates about national security, institutional integrity, social cohesion, and so on. We set out really to map that transition from those earlier days, which we call days of innocence, of the 1980s and 1990s, through to more fraught times, or the times of experience under Xi Jinping. And the authors are based in all Australian states and territories, and they offer close readings of relations with China in their particular jurisdictions. We also have additional chapters focusing on local and regional business networks, the challenges of university engagements, constitutional issues presented by state-level relations with an international actor like China, and the place of local-to-local networking in the Communist Party's own United Front playbook. And I think you'll find these chapters very informative and instructive. But on top of mapping that transition and the local relations, we try to chart new rules of engagement for what we call the paradox of paradiplomacy for Australia. That is, to help those who want to maintain relations with their counterparts in China despite all the difficulties, and how we can maybe do it going forward. The paradox is this: the further removed local actors are from having to worry about national security or national interests, then the greater their opportunities for open dialogue, for cooperation, for building trust. Local relations and people-to-people ties familiarise communities with one another. They're the basis for business and community networks, and they build broad understanding, and all going well, build trust. That has to be a good thing, and we support it where we find it. On the downside of this paradox, the greater the distance from strategic or security policy making, then the greater the risks that local actors face of taking missteps in matters of security or foreign policy, which is not normally their area of concern. Then when ideological norms and political systems in the two countries don't align, and they don't at present between China and Australia, then the risk calculus in these kind of local-to-local subnational relations can escalate very sharply. And we find this is what's happened in the era of Xi Jinping. We argue, as did Bertil, that subnational diplomacy between countries works best when it's undertaken on a transparent, egalitarian, inclusive field of play, without fear of censorship, without fear of retribution. And we don't assume those conditions apply in every case. The benefits of diaspora diplomacy with China, for example, are difficult to realize when immigrant communities on the one side fear that their families and friends on the other will be harassed or detained if they say or do anything out of turn. That's not good for diaspora diplomacy. And the free play of digital diplomacy requires a level playing field. That is not the case in China. There is not an open internet. And while subnational, twin city or sister city diplomacy, sister state relations certainly have mutual benefits, China's pervasive united front operations carry risks that aren't widely appreciated at the local level. So, just in sum, and to sum up here, Australia stands to benefit substantially from continuing people-to-people, diaspora and subnational diplomatic engagements with China. But maintaining the flows while minimising risks calls for something new. It calls for responsive, coherent and resilient systems for managing relations among state and local governments and community organisations and the federal government as well in their dealings with China. This means all Australians need to be clear-headed about their values and interests. They need to be clear-eyed about the risks as well as opportunities of their engagements. And they need to be clear-minded about the purposes their initiatives serve in the bilateral relationship and be ever ready to adjust those plans when outcomes don't turn out as anticipated. And I think that's where we are at the present time. We're in a time of adjustment. We've mapped out the transition and we're looking to new modes of engagement going forward. Thank you.
John, that's excellent. Thank you. And you were coming across loud and clear, but also a little scratchy from time to time because your mic is a little too close to your very handsome beard. So when we get to Q&A, that's probably going to be a better place for it. So thank you for that. And let me turn now to our senators for their remarks. Boy, it's been a really interesting few days on the China front. The launch of this book, totally coincidentally, just comes a few days after the revelations from Mike Burgess, Director General of ASIO, about a state-backed attempt to influence the selection of candidates for a federal election. And of course, Mike did not name the country or indeed actually the election, be it a state or a federal election. But it seems to have been made pretty clear in subsequent comments to the media that we are in fact talking about China. I'll be interested to see if our senators want to offer any reflections on that. But first, James, can I come to you? Any thoughts in regard to the book? Any thoughts in regard to the big challenges that we're facing in this relationship? Over to you.
Thanks, Peter. I really appreciate the invitation to be here tonight, and I want to commend ASPI, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and particularly Professor Fitzgerald for this remarkable publication. You have brought together a terrific collection of authors whose work I follow closely and admire greatly. It is a very sobering read. You have done a great public service by putting into the public domain the comprehensive, sophisticated and coordinated attempts of the Chinese Communist Party, and in particular the United Front Work Department, to undermine Australia's national consensus on national security and foreign affairs, and it frankly should be compulsory reading for local councils, state and territory governments and universities. It is a window into a road we as a country could have sleepwalked down had history been only slightly different. Thanks to the wake-up calls like the Dastyari affair, the efforts of investigative journalists and the impressive work of our intelligence and security agencies, we have avoided some of the worst pitfalls. But it almost doesn't bear thinking about what our democracy would have looked like had we not. While thanks to ASPI and others, we now have a much greater awareness of the dangers of foreign interference and espionage, the danger has not passed. As Peter said, in the annual threat assessment by the Director General of ASIO, Mike Burgess, last week is a reminder of that. ASIO now assesses that foreign interference and espionage has passed terrorism as our principal security concern. Not all of that is directed at the federal level, as is well documented in this publication. In fact, it's often targeted at the point of least resistance, and that may be at the level of government that is least well equipped to detect it. Mike Burgess told the story of a successfully disrupted foreign interference scheme, but our adversaries are determined and creative, and they will try again. They probably are right now. We need to be constantly vigilant to these threats. I remain concerned about the vulnerability of our state governments, our local councils, and our universities. The Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security's inquiry into the higher education sector has uncovered some disturbing insights into the dependency our leading universities have fallen into with their counterpart Chinese universities, and also from the income from Chinese international students and the effect this has had on their policies. We will soon hand down our recommendations about the changes required to better protect our higher education sector and ensure that it supports Australia's national interests rather than too often undermining it. The committee is also currently reviewing the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme. FITS is a very important step towards greater transparency from those who seek to influence public debate on behalf of foreign governments. But I think we can all see that it has not worked perfectly since its inception, and it needs tweaking to ensure that it is appropriately targeted to the highest risk conduct. I'm very pleased that thanks to the passage of the Foreign Relations Act last year, the Foreign Minister now has the power to veto agreements not in our national interest, but it is a blunt instrument and it cannot prevent all threats. What is also required from other levels of government is some humility and an acceptance that international relations is not their field of expertise, nor their primary responsibility. I appreciate when you're sitting in a meeting discussing a new local recycling and green waste strategy, that it might be tempting to alleviate your boredom with some contributions in the field of geopolitics. But if that is your passion, I invite you to stand for the Federal Parliament, not your local council. In a more benign security environment, most of these international engagements would be harmless, although personally, I doubt the value for ratepayers from multiple sister city relationships. But in an era of strategic competition, even with the best will in the world, our subnational governments and universities are just not equipped with the information or resources they need to navigate these issues in the national interest. We have moved from a transactional economic relationship with China to one that more closely resembles a clash of systems. And thanks to the release of the 14 demands, we can now clearly see that the Chinese government believes that it can and should dictate to us our domestic public policy settings. There is now no excuse for naivety about our relationship with China, nor is there any excuse about being unaware of the influence operations they wield against us at every level of government to seek to internally divide us and weaken our ability to resist their coercion. So Peter, I hope you have sent copies of the book to our premiers, our chief ministers, our mayors and vice chancellors, and I hope when they receive it, they read it very carefully. Thank you very much for this important contribution to the public debate on foreign interference.
James, thank you so much. And yeah, we haven't sent it to all mayors, but we did get a question. Where can you get hold of a copy? You can download this now from the ASPI website, aspi.org.au. If you want hard copies, by all means email to ask, but it's an expensive publication, so please don't ask me for 500 or something like that, but we'll see what we can do. James, I can't resist the temptation. In my chapter, which was on the university sectors, one of my recommendations was the removing of Confucius Institutes from Australian campuses. Are you able to say what your committee's report might say about that issue, or do you have personal views you'd like to share with us on that point?
It's a kind invitation, Peter, and a tempting one to take up, but I would be in big trouble with my colleagues on the PJCS if I spoke on their behalf before we had finalised and agreed to our report. Safe to say that the Confucius Institutes and their activities were of great interest to the committee during the inquiry, and I'm sure we'll have something to say about it, but exactly what we have to say about it, I'll have to wait until I've corralled my colleagues to agree.
Excellent. Thank you, James. Well, let me go now to Senator Kimberley Kitching. Kimberley, very interested to hear your views. You've been getting a certain amount of media coverage yourself over the last 24 hours in relation to these issues. So let me hand the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I will start by saying I was elected on the Melbourne City Council, and we had an international affairs department. You know, and obviously we had a sister city relationship with a city in China. And I think, you know, this, I'll have to talk to James about it in more detail, but it was always interesting. Look, I'm so grateful to be here, and it's a great privilege to be here to speak at the launch of ASPI's new publication, edited by Professor John Fitzgerald. There are very few people better qualified than John to explore the complexities of Australia's relationship with the People's Republic of China. John served for 5 years in Beijing as China representative of the Ford Foundation, and before that was director of the International Centre of Excellence in Asia Pacific Studies at the Australian National University. He has written extensively on Chinese history and politics, as well as on the history of the Chinese diaspora. His previous books include Big White Lie, Chinese Australians in White Australia, which was awarded the Ernest Scott Prize of the Australian Historical Association. And I have to say, I am also grateful for his friendship, for his great kindness. He's a very kind person, and he is excellent at ordering when we have lunch. So thank you, John. The publication that we're here to discuss today serves as an important reminder that Australia doesn't have just one relationship with China. As a federation, it has 9 separate relationships. But it also reminds me, and we can talk about this later, but it also reminds me that our sovereignty is all important, I believe. And the tenets of a democracy, including free and fair elections, and I'll say that again, free and fair elections, the rule of law, the freedom of the press, the protection of the rights of minorities, these must be protected. They have to be protected, and our sovereignty must be protected. Although the Constitution reserves external affairs to the federal government, ever since Gough Whitlam re-established diplomatic relations with China in 1973, all the Australian states and territories have sought to build partnerships in China, and successive federal governments of all parties have taken a fairly relaxed view of this. The motives of the state and territory governments in building relationships in China have, of course, been overwhelmingly economic. They have sought markets for their products, investment for their projects, students for their schools and universities, and tourists for their hotels and resorts. All of this has been, I would say, absolutely natural, and indeed has been immensely beneficial for Australia. We have enjoyed more than 30 years of low inflation and steady growth in large part because of our access to Chinese markets for our exports and to our ability to import cheap Chinese consumer goods. And I would say there is nothing unusual in this. There are many countries around the world in the same position. But ever since Deng Xiaoping began to liberalise the Chinese economy more than 40 years ago, every national and subnational government in the Western world has been beating a path to China's door. And Australia has done very well in the rush to find new opportunities in China. In some respects, we have been at the head of the queue. As China has grown rapidly wealthier, its booming industries have been hungry for Australian iron ore, coal and other resources. Its consumers have grown prodigiously in both numbers and appetites for imported goods, and its outflow of fee-paying students and free-spending tourists has also multiplied. Unfortunately, there is no such thing as a purely economic relationship with China, or with any province, any city, university, company, or individual in China. Everything and everyone in China are ultimately under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, and the agenda of the Communist Party has always been entirely political. In the 30 years following Deng Xiaoping's reforms, it suited the Communist Party's political agenda that China should open up to foreign trade and investment, and that Chinese companies and institutions should forge commercial and cultural relationships with foreign companies and institutions to their mutual benefit. The Communist Party, while always ultimately in control, was content to take a back seat while a newly emboldened entrepreneurial class made rapid fortunes. When Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, all that began to change. President Xi is of CCP royalty. He was born and has been raised in the elite ranks of the party. This is not unique among the Chinese leadership, but where previous leaders had shown a willingness to open up and integrate into the global economic and trade system, Xi is turning his back on this in an insular move aimed at self-reliance. Xi believes absolutely that it is the party's historic role to lead China back to the great power status and the dominant position in the Asia-Pacific region that enjoyed before what he sees as the national humiliations of the 19th and early 20th centuries. His pronouncement suggests that now that China is rich and powerful, thanks largely to the operation of the free market forces unleashed by Deng and maintained by his successors. It is time to rein in those forces and return to the path of socialist virtue, of social discipline, and of national assertion. I think the Western world has been slow to understand the import of these changes, and even slower to make the necessary policy adjustments. I think it's fair to say that Australia, as one of the countries which has benefited most from close economic ties with China, has been among the most reluctant to accept that the days of trouble-free mutual enrichment are over, and they are over. Over the last few years, we've had a rapid education in the true nature of the Chinese regime. We have seen harsh repression of dissent among Chinese intellectuals, the public shaming and disgrace of leading Chinese business figures, the blatant violation of the autonomy which was promised to Hong Kong, and the terrible, terrible consequences for those who believe in democracy there. And I think we should all think much more about Hong Kong and what has happened there and what will continue to happen to the democracy activists there. We've also seen the suppression and obscenity directed towards the Uyghur and Turkic Muslim populations in the Xinjiang region, the escalating military threat to Taiwan, the illegal militarization of the South China Sea, the use of trade ties as a means of intimidation and coercion, and the bullying and hectoring tone of Chinese diplomats in Australia and across our region. And I think Bertil spoke very well about all of this. As the scales have fallen from Australian eyes, we have been forced to be much more vigilant about attempts by the Chinese Communist Party to extend its influence in this country. And my friend and colleague James Paterson spoke about this as well. No Australian party of government or responsible commentator is suggesting a decoupling with China. But we do need to make it clear that the Constitution means what it says. Political relationships with foreign governments are the prerogative of the federal government and not of the states and territories. The Commonwealth has the right to veto investments, acquisitions and involvement in sectors which have national security or defence implications, and federal governments should exercise that right. And I am proud that my party, the Australian Labor Party, has always upheld this belief in federal power. Perhaps most insidious has been the attempt to divide and infiltrate Australia's large Chinese community to serve the ends of the Chinese Communist Party. And the committee that I chair last year did a report into diaspora communities in Australia. This has been the very unfortunate effect this has had the unfortunate effect of placing Australians of Chinese origin in a difficult position. Racism, I believe, should be countered in all its forms. It is an evil. And I believe much more vigorous action is needed to combat it. Events in recent days, as Peter has suggested, have only served to highlight how vigilant we need to be in protecting sovereignty and upholding democracy. And, I pledge to serve in this Parliament to protect sovereignty and to uphold democracy. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Kimberly. We've got some questions coming in, and there's one that I've just noted, which I think is particularly relevant to our two senators. So if I may, I might just put this one to you for your reactions. Kimberly first, then James. It comes from Joe, who says, times have changed. The battlefield now is information. Democratic strengths of openness have been twisted towards weakness by autocratic states. How do we educate all levels of government and Australians writ large of this threat using a critical, non-partisan approach? That's a good question. Kimberly, any sort of reactions or thoughts, and then to James?
I think that people, I can say that colleagues here are much more aware now than they were in the past, and by that I mean the last year, couple of years, about these issues, about the issue of the control of information. But I think it's up to countries like Australia, like-minded countries, to look at places like the ITU, the International Technology, it's an entity of the United Nations. And I think what we've seen is recently there's been a Chinese head of that organisation, and there's certainly been a desire by him to control information. So how does the internet work? And obviously, we have a very different, I think, different view of the internet. So we think of it as a place to get information. That's not how the Chinese Communist Party thinks of the internet. They think of it as a way of controlling information. So we're sort of outward looking, they're inward looking. And I think, those sorts of, we need to be very strong, I think, about entities like the ITU. And I think also, we don't want authoritarian regimes controlling information sources. I believe that Australia should have more satellites, and satellites are about projecting and, taking data and transferring data. So that's another take on it, but I think we need sort of more control over that. And I think democracies, the like-minded countries, like-minded democracies, need to be more forceful about this. And I think it's not just about Australian politicians, it's about our colleagues in other parliaments around the world, and how we can work together to ensure that we can retain control over those sorts of information flows. I'm not sure, does that answer the question?
I think it's a good start for a discussion, Kimberly. James, can democracies win on the information battlefield?
Just very quickly to add, I think openness is our strength, and a concrete recent example of that is the way in which the Biden administration has very creatively declassified intelligence in relation to Russia's intentions towards Ukraine. Now, there are good reasons not to declassify intelligence. It can inadvertently expose sources and methods, but it is collected for a very good reason. And there's no better reason than to try and avert the largest ground war in Europe since 1945. And the way in which they have called out the planned false flag operations that Russia intends to undertake to justify an invasion of Ukraine has been very powerful. And I know other European partners have done the same. And I'd like to see more of that, because we are comfortable with that openness. We are open and transparent. Autocracies fear it, and it is a weakness of theirs. So we should lean into that.
I'd love to have been a fly on the wall for some of those intelligence agencies, James, as the Biden administration speculated about how to get that information public. But I think what I'll do now is turn to two of the authors that have chapters in the report. Anne-Marie, firstly to you. You wrote a chapter entitled "Encircling the City from the Countryside," a template of CCP United Front work at subnational level, which in many ways is a foundational chapter because it really describes in some ways the CCC game plan for how to influence states and territories. Can I ask you to just give us a brief summary of the high points of that chapter?
Kia ora koutou katoa. Warm Pacific greetings, everyone, from Christchurch, Otautahi, New Zealand. So my chapter really gave an overview of what to look for and what the local governments and state governments in Australia and in other countries too have been experiencing, what political interference at the local level looks like. So it tends to go under the radar a lot because foreign policy is the constitutional responsibility of the central government. And my paper was entitled "Using the Local to Surround the Central and the Countryside to Surround the Cities," which is a famous saying of Mao Zedong. The CCP used this technique to come to power during the Chinese Civil War. The CCP steadily worked on local entities and trying to influence local elites, and steadily surrounded the main government areas which were under KMT control, and that was part of how the CCP came to power. So this saying is a metaphor for the CCP's tactic of targeting local governments and authorities, because, as has been said, these are entities that don't have access to good foreign policy advice or security briefings, and they have control over a lot of aspects of our society that are useful and interesting to the CCP, as well as often local politicians have very close connections to central government. And, for example, local authorities could have control over water, development, education links, investment, museums, libraries, community groups. These are all interesting and useful for the CCP's political interference activities. So the phrase that the CCP uses to talk about what we call political interference is united front work. And united front work is the task of every single party member. That's what the CCP says. So often people talk about the United Front Work Department, but that's just one agency engaging in united front work. I talk about in my research the party state military market nexus. So as Kimberly said, Chinese companies can be weaponized and required by Chinese law, in fact, to act on behalf of the CCP government's interests. And, you know, the goals, United Front Work tactic, amongst some of the goals are to develop assets of key figures, influential figures, to access sensitive technology as a priority these days, to shape policies and politics in foreign countries. And of course, espionage is also an aspect to it. And there are 4 themes or 4 key areas that I highlighted in my paper. And in my paper, I created a template, actually. So if we do have anyone from local government or universities listening, and I encourage you to look at it, and you can have a look and see if any of those aspects that I highlight look familiar to you. I think you will find that some are familiar. So the 4 categories are targeting our overseas Chinese diaspora. The CCP regards the Chinese living abroad as a tool, and they actually talk about that. And of course, that takes agency away from our Chinese diaspora. And one of the key challenges in our resilience strategy is how to support true pluralism in our Chinese diaspora community groups and in their Chinese language media as well. And also how to prevent racism coming from the frank discussion of these issues. And one of the ways I'd recommend is please be very careful in the way you talk about this. Talk about the CCP government, talk about the People's Republic of China. Don't just use Chinese freely when you're really talking about the CCP or China. We have to make it really clear here we're talking about, just like when we talk about the US, we talk about the president or the Republican Party and so on, and we don't make a broad generalization about the American people. So another category that gets targeted is our economic and political elites. And then there's the effort to tell a good story of China, this strategic communication strategy. And the 4th category identified is the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, the state of Victoria famously signed up to that, although it was outside the federal government policy. So the aim of influencing the elites is to try and corrupt them, to get information from them, or to sway their views, and so that they will enact policies that are favourable to the CCP. The goal of targeting the overseas Chinese community is, one, to neutralise them. That's something that we should highlight, is that the CCP is very worried about the overseas Chinese diaspora, that they could become a nest for critical voices that could undermine the CCP's authority in China, and that there could be dissident groups would be supported that would help to undermine political change. So unfortunately for all of us, the CCP's problem becomes our problem in our democracies, because the CCP's agenda ends up undermining our political situation here, as Kimberly was talking about, the really damaging impact on our democracies with regarding to political candidates and donations, for example. The strategic communication agenda is to promote a pro-CCP message globally. And now increasingly, we're also seeing disinformation as part of that, and undermining the good work that governments are doing, for example, in the COVID era, on vaccinations, creating anxiety and fear amongst diaspora communities about the vaccines that are common in our societies. On Belt and Road Initiative, It's a China-centered global order, political, economic, military order. And China is looking to access resources, strategic resources, to have access to ports and air bases, technologies. So it's a really big deal if your local government is involved in that in any way, and your central government does not want to be involved. So let's look at what we can do about it. So I recommended that each country devise a national resilience strategy, and it has to be non-political and cross-party and involve local and central government, as well as local entities like the universities. And there has to be this two-wheel approach. One wheel is the wheel of the discussion within government, which is classified sources, and there's counter-foreign interference coordination across your government in Australia and New Zealand and many other governments in the EU and other Five Eyes countries are doing this. There has to be the public conversation wheel as well. You have to get the public to be well informed and understanding what the issues are and be part of the solution, because as was said, the laws can't fix everything. So we need our political leaders to speak frankly and without inflame, and not in an inflammatory way, factually about the problem. So the analogy I use is about the way that our governments have talked about our pandemic, factually, and then talk about what we need to do to deal with it. We don't need ideology, and we don't need demonizing when we deal with this problem. It is an issue about our own internal national security and our own rights to decide how we run our countries. And one final point I want to make, that we really must not be naive about this. These efforts to target our local governments and local entities didn't just begin in the Xi era. They're a long-standing practice of the CCP, and unfortunately, your government and mine and our local governments were like the frogs in the pot. The water was simmering away, and luckily, Australia jumped out of the pot, and many other countries have jumped out of the pot and realized what is going on. But if you read the Chinese sources as I do, it's very clear that this is not something that just started happening. It's just that we have understood it better and can make better decisions about our interactions with China. Thank you.
Anne-Marie, thank you so much. That's really fascinating. And last, but absolutely by no means least, I want to turn to Mark Harrison. Mark wrote the chapter on Tasmania, which is fascinating. A small jurisdiction, but a state with a major level of importance because of its role as a gateway to Antarctica, and obviously an integral part of the Commonwealth. Mark, very interested to hear a summary from you about some of the high points from your chapter.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks to ASPI and to KAS for putting this book, establishing this book, and to John for your enormous amount of work. Just to sort of summarize the points in my chapter, for Tasmania, the basic story is it's a very long-standing relationship with China, goes right back to the 19th century. But as John alluded to, it really took off in the 2010s, ultimately driven by trade. But Xi Jinping's visit to Tasmania in 2014 is a key moment in sort of focusing the politics and policy in the state around China. So in the 2010s, the state government really decided that international relations were a legitimate area of state government activity. And it's fair to say that Beijing saw this as an opportunity for its own interests. So the basic argument of the chapter is that the state-level international relations were partially or inadequately institutionalized, and they rested on very limited conceptual foundations that were really established at the very beginning of the 1980s, in fact. So the relationship with China grew to be a very significant, even dominant part of state government policy and politics in the 2010s. But it didn't come with any kind of calculation of the national interest or the kind of balanced concerns between diplomacy, trade, defense, intelligence, and so on that you get at the national level. So it was a very distorted relationship. The way I describe it is a kind of political and policy monomania. China came to be understood for a period of time in Tasmania as the solution to the state's problems, rather than a calculated or grounded, disinterested relationship practice. And on the other side, China also built out the relationship in the 2010s very actively. But I think you can also see, and I think this is an observation that's important to think about, that China also has policy constraints and capacity constraints. So it has these distinctive methods of building relations that Anne-Marie's alluded to, United Front work, but all of these delegations and MOUs and all that sort of stuff. But you can also see that it didn't have a lot to draw on in dealing with Tasmania, and it probably hasn't achieved everything that it might have hoped for, I think is a fair assessment. Today, I think you can say that the heat has gone out of the relationship because of the broader circumstances with Australia-China relations and federal legislation. As I said at the end of my chapter, for Tasmania, it's the future of China's interests in Antarctica that are really the greatest test of policy capacity in the state, and really nothing that's come up to this point fully prepares the state for that future. So there's a lot of work to do. The final comment I make is that the China relationship is a uniquely demanding one. And I think we haven't fully sort of thought about it in that way. China is a unique place, and it's just a uniquely demanding relationship. And for those of us who want to see a relationship that's realistic and grounded and built with the capacity to make properly informed and principled decisions, the last several years in Tasmania, certainly, and I think in other parts of Australia, for those of us who want that, has not been a particularly easy time. So I warmly thank John and the publishers for at least giving me the opportunity to process some of the craziness that's gone on here. And as I was saying before we started, there's a huge amount that is yet to be said. I didn't talk about the Hobart City Council or the University of Tasmania or many other organisations, and there's some really crazy things that have gone on and continue to go on. And so there's probably an entire book that could be written just about Tasmania, I think. So I think this is a great first step in thinking very deeply about how these relationships work. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Mark. And I'm trying to sort of aggregate a number of questions that we've been receiving whilst people have been speaking. One of them goes to the challenges of not just whole of government, but whole of government's coordination around these policy issues. John, I'm going to throw this one to you. What are your sort of thoughts about that? I mean, I don't think it's an accident that we've seen such CCP emphasis on engaging with the Australian states, precisely because those entities, you know, do not have intelligence establishments, are not responsible constitutionally for national security, and therefore tend not to think about those national security issues. How can we sort of improve the quality of conversation that brings all of these entities together to kind of shape a response to the problem? John, I'll go to you, and then I'd be interested to see if the senators have got a view on that point as well.
So just briefly, Peter, I think the federal government has been moving on the legislative front with the FITS and the Foreign Relations Act, and that's very, very important. But they only go so far. There's a larger public educational role that organisations like ASPI and perhaps our universities can help to play as well. But thirdly, I think there's an institutional initiative that's just come up during COVID, and that's the National Cabinet. And I think that's a framework for conversations, not necessarily between premiers and the Prime Minister, but between very, very senior public servants at each level, which is a general public consciousness raising exercise that, you know, within the bureaucratic elite. And I think if we can do that, if the National Cabinet can play that role, then we're likely to see greater institutional response at state and territory level as well. That's not to say we don't also need this educational legislative response, but where we argue for a national resilience strategy, which was first proposed by Anne-Marie, as she pointed out, it would include all of these components.
Thanks, John. And James, any responses from you on this challenge of getting all the governments to sort of understand the issue at roughly the same level of depth?
Yeah, look, consensus building in democracies is inherently messy, and I know it is trite to say it's a flaw and a weakness of our system that we can't all agree and can't all get on the same page, but that's the beauty of our system as well. And the great virtue of it is that when we do achieve consensus, although it might take some time and some change of governments and elections and debates, it's much more durable than any artificial consensus that's imposed in dictatorship from the top down, which we know could disappear in a second if there's a change of leadership. So yes, in the short term, perhaps autocracies are going to reach that point of consensus earlier, but ours is going to be more durable and effective, I ultimately believe.
Thank you. And Kimberly, some thoughts from you?
I always think of autocratic regimes as like they're like the Eye of Sauron in the Lord of the Rings. They can focus wherever they want to. Democracies aren't like that. We don't have central command and control, and that is the beauty of our system. When I think of the United States dealing with COVID, it looked messy, but democracies are messy, and as James says, there's a beauty in that. We allow people to think for themselves and to have their own thoughts, express their own thoughts. On resilience, I agree with John. I think we have to, I think in a democracy you must bring people with you. So there has to be, an educative aspect of this. And I think in terms of the state and territory governments, I think they can avail themselves as well of, if a state premier or a chief minister wrote to the security agencies and asked for a briefing, I'm pretty sure that they'd get it. So, they have some responsibility as well in this. They can inform, be informed themselves as well. It's not all about someone coming to them. I think they can, be curious and ask questions as well.
Thanks, Kimberly. Reading Lord of the Rings, I'm reminded that things will get an awful lot worse before they get better. I think we're probably sort of halfway through the second book, actually, in terms of our global situation. But look, I'm conscious of time, folks. We've had some great questions here, but I'm going to end with a very short one that Victor Purton put. And I'm going to ask this to all of you, so I'm going to ask you to be brief. Victor's question is, what, if anything, makes you optimistic? And I'll let you interpret that question however you would like to interpret it. Victor knows I'm one of life's pessimists, which is what you get after being a strategist all your working life. But John, I'll go to you first, then Bertel, and we'll work through the team. What, if anything, makes you optimistic? And you're on mute, John.
The way in which Australia has responded, raucous and crazy as it's been at times, gives me great cause for optimism. Is for me a great cause for optimism. I think we're seeing a public conversation of a kind we couldn't have had, say, 7 or 8 years ago, and it's led to significant changes in behaviours, in understanding, and of institutional relationships, and that gives me cause for hope. Brilliant,
Bertel.
When it comes to Australia, with the short and limited amount of experience that I have, I'm very confident and very optimistic. Coming here, I've learned in a very short period of time that Australians are very friendly people. But in politics, when it comes down to exterior and interior security, this is sort of where the buck stops, as the Americans would say. I think that in the few months that I've been here, you could see this exemplary on the AUKUS Defence Association that was founded. You could also see it in recent events around the big tennis tournament when it came to interior security. We are challenged also, if you allow me to briefly recur on the situation in Europe. We are confronted with a situation where also authoritarian states are basically conducting long thought lost cannon boat policies of the 19th century, but we are, as strong and liberal-minded nations, we are very strong if we use our soft power strength together. For that reason, we must align even further, and I'm very confident that we will do so, especially when it comes to bilateral relations with Germany, Australia, but also with the EU.
Bertel, thanks. James, you have to be an optimist to be a senator, don't you?
I guess so. Look, historical analogies are imperfect, but our societies have faced challenges like this before, and we have prevailed. And we prevailed then, as I believe we will now, because I believe our system is superior. Market liberal democracies do produce the innovation and the entrepreneurship and the ingenuity and the human flourishing that we need to prevail. And ultimately, I believe we will.
Thank you. And Kimberly?
Well, people make me optimistic, and you come across great people, and I believe people are good, and I think that the people of democracies, and I think that, as James says, there's a flourishing, the human spirit is enabled, can flourish in a democracy. I don't believe it can do that in authoritarian regimes, and I think it's of that flourishing. There's some, it's beautiful. I'm rereading the Iliad, which obviously is about the Trojan War, and I'm just reminded, there's goodness in some of the smallest acts. In what was if it happened, what was a terrible war. So, but there's goodness, I think, in people, and that makes me optimistic.
Thanks, Kimberly. Watch out for those wooden horses, I guess. Anne-Marie, so can we have a dose of optimism from New Zealand, please?
Well, I think we've heard quite a lot of optimism already. So I'm going to give you some pessimism. So I think that while, yes, our societies have a lot of resilience, and New Zealand and Australia are fairly good on social cohesion, and I'm pleased to see the international response, I think that we should be very alert for backsliding. And there is a lot of still within our society, for example, the business community, who would wish that the governments would just stop talking about this sort of stuff. And China works on them very hard. I am a bit pessimistic and worried about the hopelessness that I noticed amongst many people that I have talked to about it in some areas of government, who think that it's too late, that we can't do anything about this and we should just give up. And that leads to thinking about appeasement. So we do need to wake up now, and we need to deal with this in a factual way, and it's not going to go away. I think the best example of the country who deals well with a threat like this is Finland and Russia. They've got a sizable Russian minority, and they manage to educate their population on how to deal with their pressures, and then they just get on with life. And we've got to be the same. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very interesting comparison, actually. Mark, last word to you, actually.
Yeah, look, I think some really tough lessons have been learned in Tasmania about dealing with China. And some grand schemes have gone really badly wrong. But I think politics and policymakers, many of them have learned those lessons. And I think, so being able to see a system able to learn from mistakes is what gives me some optimism. I think there are plenty of people, to allude to Anne-Marie's comments, who haven't learned quite enough, but there are plenty of people who've learned a lot, and are positioning the state, in giving it a stronger position than it might have had 5 or 6 years ago.
Thanks, Mark, and a nice comment from Sean Moran to end the session. He says we should perhaps say hi to our CCP friends who are without doubt listening, and remind them that we strive for peace and sovereignty always, not just peace at the expense of sovereignty. That's absolutely right. Well, thanks to our brilliant senators, James Paterson and Kimberley Kitching, and thanks for the great work that you're both doing to keep Australia safe. Thanks to our excellent and erudite editor, John Fitzgerald, to Bertel Wenger for his support, to Mark Harrison and Anne-Marie Brady for their expert contributions. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. I hope I'll be able to see you all at a physical ASPI event at some stage in the not too distant future. Thanks, everyone.